As I imagine you can realize, this is not a topic that occurred to me many years ago. As a matter of fact, I remember exactly when it occurred to me. It was just before my last, well, simultaneously my last public presentation and my first online lecture. And this was at the Czech Center on March 13th. It was the spring was supposed to be a celebration of Janacek's Katja Kabanova that the Metropolitan Opera was going to do. And of course, as we know, there was no production of Katja, and the Met is not in business at the moment. So I was thinking about how to introduce this exhibit at the Czech Center, and it occurred to me just at this moment that both of Janacek's children had died of infectious diseases, and that some of the things that we were feeling and experiencing were things that the people we study and the musicians we listen to experience with genuine regularity. And it got me thinking about that. And so tonight, I'd like to explore at least some of the things that come into view if you consider Czech music history through the lens of infectious disease. And part of that will be putting together a kind of compendium of how various people were impacted by the disease. And the second will be at least a preliminary attempt to sketch out ways of considering the effect of infectious disease on the creative imagination of some composers and specific creations. Of course, this is not an idle theme, but it's part of a much larger consideration of a question that we often find ourselves asking, which is what, after all, is the relationship between music and the rest of the world. I'm influenced also in this by a wonderful book which I read many years ago by a man named Hans Zinzer called Rats, Lice, and History, which was an attempt to write about the impact of disease on the course of history. And he sets a wonderful example of how to do this. Well, it goes without saying for any of us that the history of Western music has been dramatically affected by infectious disease. Imagine only if figures like Mozart, Schubert, Carl Maria von Weber, Schumann, Chopin, Donizetti, Bizet, Mahler, Berg, Tchaikovsky, Paganini, Hugo Wolf, Szymanowski, and Lily Boulanger had lived anything close to normal lifespans. All of them were struck down by various kinds of infectious disease. And this doesn't even consider the larger question of how the fear of disease and the concern about disease played on their compositional imaginations and those of their contemporaries. If this larger field of infectious disease in the history of Western music is not really well plowed, it goes doubly so or triply for Czech music and infectious disease. I couldn't help it, so I sort of Googled Czech music and infectious disease, and immediately in Wikipedia, 4 names came up, which will tell you about the state of research. One was Ladislav Klima, 19th century novelist and philosopher, okay. The second was Leoš Janacek, we'll talk about him later. The third was Reinhard Heydrich, who was considered some part of the history of Czech infectious disease. And the last one, inexplicably, was Gavrilo Princip, the famous assassin of Sarajevo, who died in Terezin. So this was the sort of the state of the art of Czech history and infectious disease. So again, this is a kind of strange world, and I'll try to illuminate it in various ways as I go. I'll be moving from full screen to, I'm going to share my screen and do a PowerPoint presentation, and we will begin. So I hope appropriately, I want to begin with just a quick shout out to some of the people who have helped me a great deal in putting this together. As you can imagine, trying to do research when you're sheltering in place is a challenge, and I don't think I could have put this together without all these people. David Beveridge, Carla Hartle, who's here, and I'll mention later on, Jiří Kopetsky, Lorraine Byrne-Bodley of Maynooth, Dr. Karen Roos, who's written on the history of neurological syphilis, and Dr. Karen Beckerman, Marek Milda, who's helped, Tara Boyeka, Jan Zahor, Teresa Novitska, Susan Lutak, who introduced me, Jeffrey Chu, Olga Mojishova from the Smetana Museum, and Hannah Craven. So again, thanks very much to them for all this. So if our inquiry is to be more than just a straightforward chronicle of who did what when, we would have to begin with the question, a somewhat tricky question is, can you hear infectious disease in Czech music? I would say yes. Here it is. This is a famous, even notorious moment from Smetana's string quartet, his autobiographical string quartet, From My Life. It's well known that Smetana became ill in 1874. The posthumous diagnosis has been syphilis, although we'll revisit that a bit later. And from 1874, he started suffering a series of symptoms, quite catastrophic and dire, that affected his hearing, his speech, left him deaf, and eventually resulted in, again, the most devastating neurological symptoms. He ended his life in a psychiatric ward. And he spoke about this particular sound that he heard several times. And here are some versions of it. So my perception of the beauty of national music and the happiness resulting from this in the quartet that you just heard is interrupted by my ominous catastrophe, the beginning of my deafness. That's written in 1878. And then in a letter to Franz Liszt, he said, I believed I had to describe the beginning of my deafness, and I attempted to represent it in such a way as it has been done in the finale of the quartet with the high ease of the first violin. Before going quite deaf, I was haunted for many weeks every evening between 6 and 7 o'clock by the strident whistle of the A-flat major sixth chord, A-flat, E-flat, C, in the highest piccolo octave, uninterruptedly for half an hour, and often for a whole hour without being able to free myself of it. This happened regularly, daily, an evil omen, as it were, for the future. I therefore sought to describe this fearful catastrophe that has befallen me by the shrill E in the finale. Therefore, the E must be played fortissimo throughout. So it's widely agreed, again, that this tinnitus, this was a symptom of the neurological issues caused by syphilis. And again, in this way, his disease is made material. It's audible. But are there other ways in which we can hear infectious disease? In 1855, Smetana's daughter, Bedřiška, died at the age of 4.5. In at least 4 letters and work lists over a period of 20 years, he makes it absolutely clear that the origin of the trio is as a memorial to his daughter. And I'll quote one of them: "The loss of my oldest daughter, who was an unusually talented child, was the stimulus for my chamber work. That is the trio in G minor. In other places, he makes his passions even more stark, referring to his unforgettable daughter who was torn away from him, and that her premature death from scarlet fever was unforgivable. So here, look at the details here. We have this sort of lament of a descending chromatic fourth from D to C sharp, C, B natural, B flat. This going back to the Renaissance. Some of you know the Svelling chromatic fantasy, all these many works where this descending chromatic fourth is a sign of lament. It's not true that no works start espressivo, but that's not an ordinary way. So from the very beginning, this has a passion to it. And also, it's a single line, as if it were a single person, Smetana, mourning for his daughter as a kind of recitative before the other instruments join in. And this is another way in which I think one can hear the sound of infectious disease in the sense of a piece that is mourning for someone who is lost because of this. And how critical it was for Smetana's imagination to wrestle with this. Another thing, and again, I don't think it's possible to prove what I'm about to suggest, but if we listen again to the opening of this, we can notice a similarity to the last movement of the trio in the same key by Clara Schumann, written a few years earlier. That same move down from D to C sharp to C natural to B flat and moving downward. And again, we don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that his contact with the Schumanns meant that he would have heard this piece and known about it, probably seen a score, and that in some way, this was a further way of memorializing his daughter by imagining what she might have become. Because for him, Clara Schumann was an example of the kinds of things a woman could achieve in music, things he had wished for his daughter. And again, we've seen Smetana consciously depicting this, his own ailment. We've seen how scarlet fever impacted his imagination, but there's another level on which the inquiry can take place. This is the third movement of Smetana's second string quartet. So this is the beginning, again, of a third movement of his second quartet. And he has said, after the catastrophe, this quartet represents the turbulence of music in a person who had lost his hearing. The critical reception of this quartet has been written about, has veered from those who think it was simply the incoherent product of a diseased mind, to others like Schoenberg, who thought it was one of the great revolutionary pieces of its time. And there are many ways to view it. We could think of it as Smetana consciously trying to paint a picture of his mental state, or we could think of it as deficit, that he had no choice. This is the best he could do in organizing it. Or we can always imagine that he was just writing music. He was using his creative imagination to create effects, and these were the effects he created. But in any case, this is another piece that is closely related in many ways to the composer's condition as caused by infectious disease. For a moment, I'd like to open out to a little bit of a broader perspective, look at some pictures. So these are some of the Czech composers whose careers and lives were impacted by infectious disease. We see Smetana in the lower right-hand corner, and next to him, Zdeněk Fibich, who died at the age of only 50 of pneumonia. Janacek, who also died of pneumonia. On top, on the left, we see Erwin Schulhoff, who died of tuberculosis in the Wolfsburg concentration camp. Just as a little bit of an aside, since it's something I've been thinking about and working on, and a kind of shout out to my colleague, Anna Haikova, who works on terrorism, but also issues of gender and sexuality and the Holocaust. She and I have been thinking a lot about the fact that almost none of the composers in terrorism, and certainly not the four main ones who were studied, died of infectious disease. And one of the things that we've noted was, considering the conditions, the medical practices of epidemiology and the way epidemics were thought about, treated, and controlled in terrorism is actually superior to the way we are doing it today in the United States. Next to Schulhoff is Kapralova, Vyacheslava Kapralova, who we'll speak about in a bit, and then Josef Mysliveček. We'll begin with the one who is historically most distant, and that's Mysliveček. Mysliveček was a terrific composer. He was extremely successful. He was known as the divine bohemian in Italy, where he had an extraordinary career. And he's known quite well by anyone who studies Mozart for his appearance in the Mozart biography as one of the few composers Mozart seemed to treasure. I'll just give you a little fleeting taste of Mysliveček's sound world. Okay, so that's Mysliveček's sound world. Mysliveček was somewhat of a source of some tension between Mozart and his father. Mysliveček suffered from syphilis, and Leopold, who was a bit of a prig, really didn't want Mozart to visit him, didn't want Mozart to have anything to do with him. And this is a letter that Mozart wrote to his father. I implore you, dear Papa, to write to Mysliveček. Write to him as often as you have time. You can give him no greater pleasure, for the man is completely deserted, and often no one goes to him for a whole week. I assure you, he said, this is Mysliveček, it seems very strange that so few people come to see me. In Italy, I had company every day. If it were not for his face, he would be the same old Mysliveček, full of fire, spirit, and life. A little thin, of course, but otherwise the same excellent, cheerful fellow. Even here, they all say that the Munich doctors and surgeons have done him in. He has a fearful cancer of the bone. The surgeon, Kako, that ass, burned away his nose. Imagine what agony he must have suffered. This is, again, October 11th, 1777. It's well known that one of the effects of syphilis is the formation of guma, or non-malignant tumors that destroy the bone, and in this case create a phenomenon known as a saddle nose, where the nose collapses. And it seems as if this particular surgeon somehow, in an attempt to cure saddle nose, burned away his nose, in a terrible way. And of course, Leopold knowing that it was syphilis, told Mozart, don't have anything to do with him. And I guess I'd like to highlight this. I can't make too much of it because I don't know all that much about Mozart's intentions. But one of the things that we see with this epidemic, we saw it in the AIDS epidemic, were certain people who are in their own small way heroic. Mozart is not going to leave his friend alone just because he's suffering from this dread disease. And his father, who he pays attention to from time to time, says, don't visit him. And so I think of that as a kind of Mozart being heroic here in sticking by his friend and insisting that he should go visit him. So again, that's a heroic. And the other thing I'll say, and I'll show the next slide without comment and allow you to draw your own conclusions. So, infectious disease breeds rumors, false remedies, and charlatans like Dr. Cacao, who was, after all, responsible for many awful things. Now, we know, of course, that, I mean, as a Janacek scholar, people have always said to me, yeah, well, how good could your guy be? He didn't really have any followers. And he didn't have, look at Schoenberg, look at many other composers. And I think, well, yeah, Pavel Haas, who was a real Janachkian, he died in the camps. Gideon Klein, he followed in many ways in Janacek's footsteps. He died in the camps. And of course, Vítězslava Kapralova, who in many ways, even though she studied with Martin, anyone who was from Moravia knew that the model for a Moravian composer making an international reputation was Janacek and only Janacek. And we'll talk a bit about that. But we can note that the war destroyed at least 3 or 4 cultures. It destroyed Czech culture, destroyed German culture in the Czech lands in Czechoslovakia. It certainly destroyed Jewish culture and arguably Romani culture as well. And so this kind of displacement is something that is powerful, but one of the most powerful had nothing to do with the camps, but infectious disease. And this is the fate of Vítězslava Kapralova. She was the very definition of an extraordinary talent. She was amazing in her every way. She was a gifted conductor, a brilliant composer, and again, right on the cusp of a great international success. She was in Paris during the war. In the beginning of the war, she ended up being evacuated to Montpellier. And if you read many entries in encyclopedias, it says that she died of tuberculosis. I think we have with us today the leading Kapralova scholar, several of the leading Kapralova scholars. But I wanted to sort of show this screen, which I guess I would loosely consider 3 letters. The first letter is something I'm going to play to just give you a little taste of Kapralova's music. And this is Kapralova's last composition, which was called The Letter. And it perhaps refers to Martinu and to a love affair that's ended and its repercussions. But I just want you to hear a little bit of her music. So this is a wonderful last song written not that long before her death. On the far left is a report that was made from France by Lucien Ternier with full discussion of her condition to the musicologist Lenka Wojtyszkova, and really detailing her condition. And then we have on the right, and thanks to Carla Hartl for sending me this, a reproduction of her final letter just before her death to her husband Jiří Mucha, the son of Alphonse Mucha. And she says here, oh, I have a high fever, the professor wants to operate. Then I think it's referring to a nun, says that churchly she-devil keeps telling him that I'm better. So they give me injections, I'm vomiting. Maybe they're going to operate on me today. If not, the professor said on Monday, I must speak with him and speak with them. And then she says, abjectly, I tried to telegraph you, to send you a telegram, but it's forbidden. Please come. And then in the bottom left there, it says, I'm completely depleted. Come, signed Vitka. And this again is her last letter. There's another reason I wanted to think about Kapralova, because again, when I spoke to Carla Hartl, I said, well, she died of tuberculosis, right? Not right. There is no evidence that she had tuberculosis. And this is something that comes up quite a bit, which is the question of diagnosis. It looks like she may well have had typhoid fever. But again, to find a diagnosis of things that happened in the past, well, let me just show you the next slide to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is an article by Lucien Carhausen, sent to me by Lorraine Byrne-Bodley. Mozart's 140 causes of death and 27 mental disorders. So trying to create diagnoses of what happened medically in the past. Well, it's hard enough often when you have the patient in your own office under the best of conditions to look back and do this. And the other thing I'd like to mention in this regard is that for many years, it was assumed that Smetana had died of syphilis. And I still think it's the leading candidate. But in the last decades, a doctor came along, Jiří Ramba, and argued that the cause of Smetana's illness was lead, specifically from lead that became lodged in his skull as the result of a childhood accident, an explosion with gunpowder that entered his skull, deformed his skull, and that Smetana died not of syphilis, but osteomyelitis, which is also an infectious disease, but it's a different one, and of course, far less stigmatized. So I still think syphilis is probably the correct diagnosis. Many, many people have looked at it, but again, it's very difficult at the space of more than a century, sometimes two, to figure out exactly what happened when someone died, what were the causes. And again, I think as a historian, it's not only about infectious disease, something I don't know much about, but I certainly know something about writing history. And it's as easy to make a kind of historical misdiagnosis. And by that, I mean sort of getting your facts all wrong as it is to do it medically. And that any of us who write history have to be so careful that it's not a Procrustean bed of self-fulfilling prophecy, but rather that we keep testing, keep going back to best practices of trying to understand what happened. Now, certain diagnoses are not so problematic. It does seem that Janacek died of pneumonia, but we're not going to think about that, even though at 74 he was at the peak of his powers and in no way sickly. There is, of course, a mystery about exactly how he came to get sick, whether, as many have written, he was running after his girlfriend's son in a rainstorm, or there were other things involved, perhaps more titillating, but we simply don't know. But what we're going to look at now is something that is incontrovertible. Um, it's well known, again, that both Janacek's children died of infectious disease, scarlet fever and typhoid. Um, and his daughter Olga was dying of typhoid as he was working on and finishing Yenufa. He dedicated the opera to his daughter's memory and said famously, "I would bind Yenufa simply with the black ribbon of the long illness, the pain, and the sighing of my daughter Olga and my little boy Vladimir." And now I'm going to show a clip of a film. Most of you probably haven't seen it. As you probably know, I'm sure you do, Miloš Forman, Czech director, directed Amadeus. Around the same time, one of his compatriots, someone he had worked with and kind of grew up with as a filmmaker, Jaromír Jireš, created a Janacek biopic called The Lion with the White Mane. And I'm rather fond of this film. And I wanted to show you a scene that is documented in several sources. And this is a scene where Olga, his daughter, is dying and asks Janacek to play Yenufa for him at the piano. And again, this was reported by both Janacek's wife and his housekeeper. And she said, "Daddy, play it for me. I'm not going to ever hear it in the theater." And they spoke about it as a heart-wrenching experience as he played the opera for her. In this film, you'll see that. And then what will happen is a kind of fanciful transposition as Olga turns into Yenufa, and suddenly we're on stage at the opera. And it's the moment Kostelnička has taken Yenufa's baby, sort of illegitimate child, and killed it, both because she wants Yenufa to have a chance at a real life, but also because of the stigma and shame which she faces. Kostelnička is Yenufa's stepmother. And so she has taken the baby out. She comes back without the baby in this scene, and you'll see it. And Yenufa says, "Well, where's my baby? Is the baby with Števa?" That's the father, but not the husband. And Kostelnička says, "Your baby had a fever. You were lying with a fever, and your baby died." So we have kind of a triple fever. We have Olga's fever. We have the idea that Yenufa was supposedly suffering from a fever, and the baby died of a fever. And there's a moment which I'm going to ask you to really listen to. When Yenufa hears this, she says, my Klapchok, my little radosne, my joyous little boy." And if we can listen to that, both the kind of speech intonation and the beauty of it, I think we'll get another sense of how infectious disease creeps its way into opera, and not only in Traviata and Bohème. So here's The Lion with the White Mane, and this is the scene. There's some titles that pop up from now and again, but I'll try to talk you through it if necessary.
Kdo ví, jestli to není můj poslední?
Maybe it'll be my last Christmas.
Pláč. Já vím, že umřu.
I know I'm dying.
Tatušku, zahraj mi tu pastorkyňu.
Nechceš si počkat na premiéru?
Don't you want to wait for the premiere?
Já už ji v divadle neuslyším.
So I won't hear it in the theater.
Bude to můj nejhezčí dárek.
It'll be my most beautiful gift.
a neopušťaj mi ho, Matko milosrdenství.
Kdo to je? Jenucho, ty jsi ještě v svůru. Otevři okno. Nejsi to štávuško. No máš, otevři dveře. Proto se netřesou. Sebou. Kde je štávuška? Vy jste ho nechali ve mlýně. Snad k nám s ním dojde sám. Štěvan mami se dověďte, mamičko, proto roztoměné děcko. Děvčico, ty blouzníš, oteště pánvu. Ale ty ještě o tom neštěstí nevíš. 2 dny si spala v horečce.
Co je, tatušku?
Je to smutné, Oluško.
Ale já to chci slyšet.
She says, I want to hear it.
Neboj se,
Don't worry.
já to vydržím.
I'm going to hang in there.
Ty jsi spala v horečce. A ten tvůj chlapček umře.
He died. That's this extraordinary moment where I think Janacek is creating a kind of requiem for both his children with that exquisite, heartbreaking setting of my radiant little boy. Again, it's another way that this creeps in to various forms. When I was talking to my colleague David Beveridge, who has been incredibly helpful in putting some of this material together for this talk, he said, well, at least you're not going to really get Dvorak on this. You know, I mean, it's true Dvorak was a bit afraid of going to England because there was a flu epidemic, and we know that Dvorak had certain anxieties, but you know, how do you fit Dvorak into this? And I promised him I would. And so I want to take another tack of this and look at a passage from the New World Symphony. A lot of my work for some years was looking at connections between Dvorak's New World Symphony and the Song of Hiawatha. And while there are some arguments about exactly how much of the symphony is related to exactly what parts of Hiawatha, I think by now it's accepted completely that the second and third movement, at least, are based on passages from the Song of Hiawatha. And that the second movement, the outer portion, the famous Goin' Home, is based on the chapter called The Wooing, where Hiawatha and Minnehaha meet. But the middle section, the dark middle section, is almost certainly based, of course, almost certainly could mean isn't, so just keep that in mind. Watch my magic tricks. But I believe, after all this time doing research, that this was, the middle section was based on the famine, which is where Minnehaha dies of a fever. And I think that in this very famous passage, we can actually hear her death, and followed by a kind of little Menno funeral march. So I'll point this out, but you'll be able to hear it. and death represented by the funeral march. Here. Oh, here's Dvorak, almost certainly again depicting death from fever, something he'd witnessed, something he knew about, something he'd seen. And I want to get close to the close of this by looking at two quotes. This is Mozart. I have too much horror and disgust, too much dread and fear of diseases, and too much care for my health to fool around about with horrors. And of course, this is deals with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. This is to his father, but also this passage from D.H. Lawrence, who was convinced that the secret awareness of syphilis, and I think for that you can substitute many different kinds of diseases, which might not have quite the stigma of syphilis, but what he refers to as the utter secret terror and horror of it has an incalculable effect on the English consciousness and on American consciousness, even when the fear has never been formulated. He says, I'm convinced that some of Shakespeare's horror and despair in his tragedies arose from the shock of his consciousness of syphilis. I don't suggest for one moment that he contracted it. I've never had it myself, and yet I know and confess how profound is my fear of the disease. And even though, again, syphilis is in its own way a kind of separate category, it's also a stand-in for the fear and terror of disease, the fear of contagion and infection. And so for my last example, perhaps even more speculative than some of the others, I'd like to move to this. This, of course, is Rusalka. I'm going to suggest that whatever else Rusalka is, and it is many things, that it's also a kind of parable about infectious disease. Whether or not even the composer and the librettist were aware of it, or completely so, from the beginning, Rusalka's unnatural. She undergoes surgery, which renders her pale and perhaps feverish. She's shunned in the palace and rendered socially mute. When she returns back to the pond with her sisters, where she has lost the bet, as it were, she is treated to an extreme form of social distancing. She's ineffectively quarantined. No one's allowed to associate with her. She's completely isolated and alone. And of course, we know that her kiss is fatal, her touch is fatal. And those of us who are living through this kind of experience may empathize, may understand in some ways the incredible power of infectious diseases in the human imagination and the way it plays upon the behaviors, the imaginations, and the creations of many, many artists, of course, not only in the Czech sphere. But I hope that this brief tour of the impact of infectious disease and Czech music history has hopefully suggested some of the ways people respond to the disease. Again, as the last slide before this showed, with fear and terror, some with willful ignorance, as we see, and others with conflict, but also many people with heroism, love, and inspiration. Thank you very much.